Here and now, separate him from the precious body and blood of Christ and from the society of all Christians. We exclude him from our Holy Mother Church and all her sacraments in heaven or on earth. We declare him excommunicate and anathema. We cast him into the outer darkness. We judge him damned with the devil and his fallen angels and all the reprobate to eternal fire and everlasting pain.
Saint Thomas Becket, the man, the legend, one of the greatest saints of the Middle Ages, one of the very essential, causes of pilgrimage to Canterbury. Yeah, his martyrdom, brought a lot of strength to the church in England, but also that legend is more or less miscast today and misunderstood. Church and state relations mixed up in the whole business, and a lot of people really don't understand that. So today we're going to be talking about the great saint, and with us is Phillip Campbell, historian, author, and researcher. Thank you for joining us.
Very glad to be here.
So first off, we're going to talk about Becket, and you've written a book, or not written a book, you've republished a book with new material, which I'll put The Murder of Becket, which we'll talk about more as we get toward that end of the broadcast.
Sure.
And so that, covers all of the essential things leading up to his murder. But first, before we even get there, let's talk about how do we get there? What is England like in Becket's time? You have King Henry II. You have he's not just the King of England. He's actually the king of most of France, probably more of France than even the King of France is. And the English aristocracy speaks French, not English, and so many things. Explain a little bit. How did this empire of Henry II's come about?
Yeah, so Henry II and Becket lived in a very England was coming out of a very tumultuous time. Of course, England, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom had been conquered by the Normans in the year 1066. And then there was a period of consolidation that lasted into the early 1100s. But then from the early 1100s up until around 1150s, you had a period that's just known in English history as the Anarchy, which was a power struggle between King Henry's mother, Matilda, and then another relative, Stephen of Blois, for control of the throne. So it was a period of dynastic struggle. Henry himself was an Angevin from the Duchy of Anjou in France. And as you mentioned, he wasn't just King of England. He owned, and you were right, he owned more than half of France, more France than the French king controlled. And he had a very impressive family tree. I mentioned his mother had been a claimant to the throne of England. She was also the widow of the Holy Roman Emperor. On his father's side, he was the grandson of the King of Jerusalem. And then his great-grandfather was William the Conqueror, and his grandfather, Henry I, King of England. So he had about every, bit of noble blood that you could want. And then through a series of wars, dynastic alliances, marriage, all these different means of building his power base, he wound up in control of England, of parts of Ireland, Normandy, Brittany, Maine, Anjou in France, and then through marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, to the vast Duchy of Aquitaine in southern France. This territory is often called the Angevin Empire. So he was probably, without exaggeration, the most powerful secular character in Western Europe at the time. So just coming out of this period of chaos in the middle 12th century to consolidate into this empire, it was like a period of rebuilding, a period of the king trying to reassert control over these kingdoms that had been plagued by civil strife in the previous decades.
And in the course of this, so you have so much territory: Aquitaine, Normandy, Brittany, England. How often was Henry actually in England?
Well, he I don't know exactly how to break it down, but he spent lots of his time in Normandy. He kind of went back and forth between Normandy and England. In fact, the famous event where he's at the castle where the knights come and he says, "Who will rid me of this meddlesome priest?" That was in Bayeux in Normandy. So he kind of divided his time between his French and English possessions.
So we have so the movie, which we played that wonderful clip from the beginning with Richard Burton, it depicts Becket as a Saxon, kind of despised. And you see a lot of English films from that time that try to show this great animosity between Saxons and Normans. How much of that is true? Because certainly they're speaking different languages, number one. And so let's go back to 1066. What's the actual plight of Saxons in England at this time?
Yeah, I've noticed that too in movies and in literature also. Like if you read, Ivanhoe, it makes a big deal about this, even though it's in the reign of King John. So definitely the Saxons were definitely downgraded after the Norman conquest. Probably in the biggest single act of lay investiture ever, William the Conqueror basically dismissed the Saxon clergy and replaced them with Normans. Anglo-Norman became French at first, but then eventually Anglo-Norman became the ruling language. All the major landholders became Normans. So politically, the Saxons were entirely disenfranchised. But I don't think it's as severe as the movies make. It wasn't like the movies kind of view everything through this modern prism of nationalism, almost like the Saxons are like a nationalist minority, that's pushing for Saxon rights. In all my reading of history, I don't see anything like that. I mean, there's some shuffling around in the years after William the Conqueror, but it looks like by 1100 everything is pretty settled in, and you don't see this great animosity anymore. At least that doesn't bubble over into political or social unrest, certainly. But in the church, though, there was a big change, a big shift in how the church related to the crown during this period. And if we can talk, I mean, if you don't mind, if we can go into a little bit of the church-state stuff.
No, not at all. Let's do it.
Yeah, so it's interesting. In the Anglo-Saxon time, on the eve of the Norman conquest, you had the Anglo-Saxons had a symbiotic view of the church and the state. The state took a view of the church of like, if the church is strong, then the state will be strong. So they wanted the church to be strong, and it was kind of a symbiosis. Anglo-Saxon kings would call a council called the Witan. And what's interesting about the Witan is it could be ecclesiastical or it could be secular. If it was ecclesiastical, they called it a synod. If it was secular, they called it an assembly. But the makeup of the council was the same, no matter whether it was called for ecclesiastical reasons or secular reasons. The king was the overseer of both, and the king could dictate ecclesiastical policy. Like, for example, you see at the famous Synod of Whitby in 664, where King Oswu of Northumbria, just by royal prerogative, decides we're going to use the Roman rite and not the Celtic rite. So the kings could appoint bishops with the consent of the cathedral chapters. But there was a tendency towards sacral kingship in the Anglo-Saxon period, that the king, by virtue of his coronation, had a special custodial role over the church that he exercised directly, not through the church's mediation. And the church was, in the Anglo-Saxon era, was content with this arrangement because it also gave the church influence. It gave the church resources. So, like I said, it was a symbiotic relationship. But then when you move into the Norman period, things changed for two reasons. Number one, the Norman lords wanted to absolutely dominate the church. They didn't view it as a symbiotic relationship. They viewed it as one of domination, where the church was a tool in the hands of the Norman aristocracy. So things got more intense from the secular side. But on the clerical side as well, this coincided with the rise of what we call the Gregorian Reform movement, which was a movement asserting the church's independence from temporal interference that we associate with the investiture controversy. So moving to the Norman period, you start seeing these conflicts, like King William Rufus, King Henry I. They both had big blowouts with the church in the person of St. Anselm of Canterbury, who refused to sanction lay investiture. In fact, there's a great story that when William Rufus wanted to appoint Anselm Archbishop of Canterbury, Anselm refused to be given his staff by the king, and so the king had to send his knights to grab Anselm, and he physically dragged him into the king's sick chamber. The king was sick. The king had the staff in his hand, and they dragged Anselm to his bedside, and he forcibly thrust the staff into Anselm's hand to get him to accept the archbishopric. So you start having these conflicts over the prerogatives, and the Norman view of things is more like, if the church is too strong, then we're going to be weak. So we have to keep the church more subservient. But then you get into the period of the anarchy, which we mentioned between Matilda and Stephen of Blois. And Stephen is a supporter of the Gregorian reform. His brother is Henry of Winchester, who is a notable reformer. And Stephen makes like these charters of promises of liberties to the church in order to try to gain influence and to consolidate his position against his rival. He promises the church a bunch of things. Matilda will do the same thing. So the crown sort of yields a lot of authority back to the church during the anarchy. So when Henry I comes to the throne, he's looking at, Henry II. When he comes to the throne, he's looking at, I need to get back some of the power that the Norman lords once exercised over the church. And that's really his ideal. He wants to reset the status quo back to what he perceives to be how it was in the time of William the Conqueror. But of course, things have changed significantly since 1066. You've had the Gregorian reform, the investiture controversy, and he's simply not going to be able to go back. So that's kind of like the macro setting for the conflict between Henry and Becket. And I mean, we can talk more about the details if you want, but that's kind of like the big picture.
So Thomas Becket, the Richard Burton movie, which I would love to recommend, except it's got some very lurid things into it, so you can already see this. Hey kids, let's watch this movie about a Catholic saint. Because they have a few scenes of Henry II.
It's right when you turn it on too.
Yeah, I know. Right away, the very first thing, and Beckett's looking at betting him in his bedtime adventures with various women in the kingdom. So no, parents do not go out and get Richard Burton's Becket and say, "Oh, kids, look, a saint movie." That's actually not a good idea. But in the movie, they depict Becket as a Saxon of low birth that Henry's taken some mercy on and elevated, and that's just simply not true. He was actually a Norman. Becket was. And his parents were at least of some rank of some sort. And then he ends up in the church to paint, a little bit Becket's early life and the circles he would have moved in early on.
Yeah, so let's contrast it with the popular image from the movie, which you said portrays him as a Saxon who, really had no business being in the church, was just a low-born person. Becket was from the nobility, albeit the lower nobility. He was a Norman, not a Saxon. Born in Normandy, his father was a poor knight, possibly a relation of the Norman Archbishop of Canterbury, Theobald. Becket became a clerk early on, and he studied at Paris, he studied at Rome, he studied at Bologna. So he traveled all over Europe when he was a young man, studying at the most prestigious institutions in Europe. And like all students, he took minor orders. So he was considered a cleric. He was a sharp mind, excellent student. His services were eagerly sought after. So after his studies, he became a secretary to Archbishop Theobald and was ordained to the diaconate, which a lot of people are under the impression that Becket was a layman, that he was just a lay guy that got, invested, but he certainly wasn't. He was a deacon. And in fact, he was made the Archdeacon of Canterbury in 1154, which is a very prestigious position. An archdeacon is like the stand-in for the bishop, and like in Rome, it was very common for archdeacons to ascend to the papacy, without becoming a bishop in the intervening time, at least in the older days. So archdeacon was a very high clerical position. His duties would have included financial administration, disciplining the clergy, examination of candidates for the priesthood, oversight of the church's properties. So it was a very powerful role and gave him a lot of experience in administration and bureaucracy. Now, Becket would serve as archdeacon for 8 years, honing his administrative skill. But in 1155, he got recommended to be Chancellor of England to the king, and he served Henry admirably. It was said that they were of one heart and one mind. He helped Henry in all his in all his policies, even to the prejudice of the church sometimes, like when he got the church to pay the scutage, the shield money tax. Becket even went out to battle with Henry, so he was a skilled chancellor. But also, what's interesting, what you mentioned in the movie, where it shows Becket helping the king in his nighttime escapades. Becket was always of sound morals, clear principles. Throughout Becket's entire life, even when he had a falling out with the king, nobody ever accused him of any personal vice. He was accused of being obstinate, of being, of being stubborn, things like that. But nobody ever accused him of being immoral, which I think is interesting. So I also want to point out that Becket, it was not so. Okay, let's back up. Becket becomes chancellor, and then eventually he gets put forward. Henry wants to make him Archbishop of Canterbury when Theobald dies. Becket is initially inclined to deny this and refuse, because he knows that he will have to advocate the king's policies against that he will have to work against the king as Archbishop of Canterbury. He's going to have to put himself in opposition to the king's policies. But he actually meets the Cardinal of Pisa, and the Cardinal of Pisa tells him to submit to this because it's God's will. And so Becket assents. Now, in the movie, and I think many Catholics have this view of Becket, was that he was just this lay person who had no real background in the church, and Henry appointed him on a whim. That is how it is portrayed in the movie. Peter O'Toole's just like, I have a marvelous idea. I'm going to make you bishop. And Becket's like, oh my gosh, no. But this wasn't really that out of the common. Like if you look back to the reign of Henry I, Henry I had 6 chancellors, and of those 6, 5 of them went on to become bishops after they were chancellor. William Rufus, his Lord Chancellor, William Gifford, he went on to become the Bishop of Winchester. So this was just part of like the cursus honorum in the English, in the Anglo-Norman hierarchy, right? This was just kind of like the path you went through. There was nothing unusual about the Chancellor going on to become the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Becket was more than qualified with 8 years as an archdeacon, education from Europe's most prestigious universities and legal institutes, 7 years working for the court, and a reputation that was untarnished. So the idea that this was some kind of crazy whim of King Henry is just something I think people pick up from the movie.
Right. And it makes sense because education is something that's intertwined with ecclesiastical government, because I mean, the church basically gave education to Western Europe. As loath as people might be to admit that today, you didn't have education without the church. And then you had all the the institutions, conventions of learning, even law itself comes back to canon law. And and Thomas was a noted canonist too. So you have all of these things come together, and throughout England's history too, all the way through Henry VIII, a great number of chancellors and officials are clergy. Even under when Henry VIII becomes king, Archbishop Warham and Bishop Fox are the chancellor and the Lord of the Exchequer, respectively. And and he receives those from his father. And then he had later you get Cardinal Wolsey. In Henry VII's time, you had Cardinal Morton. In before that, you have so many different churchmen that are always in some kind of prominent role. So it's not at all out of the ordinary or ridiculous.
No, and this was specifically, like you said, because of their education, because they were simply the most highly qualified persons in Europe at the time to fulfill those roles.
So the way you'll get this in secular narration, even in various documentaries from very educated people, is Becket was the king's friend, and then he becomes the bishop and he goes native, as it were. He starts defending the interest of the church against Henry. So explain this a little bit about Becket supposedly going native. And is there because the movie makes it look like he's a practical atheist, and then all of a sudden is bishop, and now he's like, oh man, I gotta fight for the church now.
yeah. If you really, I mean, the movie, it's fun to watch, and I love the acting and the scenes. But when you start to break it down and deconstruct it, you're like, this doesn't make any sense, like how it sets it up. But the interesting thing about Becket going native is like he even warns the king about it before he appoints him. He says, if you appoint me, I'm going to have to oppose your interests in the interest of the church. It's like he already knows that's what's going to happen. And he goes from helping Henry pursue his policies to squeezing or helping Henry squeeze the church to defending the church's prerogatives zealously. And what's interesting is that the cause of his change of heart is mysterious. Like even his contemporary chroniclers comment on this. His biographers in his own day were kind of mystified by it. Some say spiritual, a more intense spiritual conversion, bureaucratic mindset. Modern commentators try to psychologize Becket and say like, oh, he was insecure about his humble background, so he had something to prove. I don't know. Maybe a little bit of all of it. My guess is that Becket had a legal mind. He had a bureaucratic mind. I think he had the mind of like what we might think of like an attorney general whose job is to advocate for the policy of whatever administration they work for, right? And Becket knows, hey, if I'm the head of the church, I have to advocate for the church's policy. Now, I think that was his initial view, but after he gets into the archbishopric, I do believe personally that the grace of the office worked upon him and that he became more thoroughly convinced of the church's right here and did begin to take it more seriously. There's evidence we can talk about when we get to the murder that Becket was personally, privately practicing ascetical practices and, really taking his spiritual life seriously. So I think at first it was just kind of, that legal mindset of I have to advocate for whatever office I'm working for, then transforming by the grace of the priesthood and the episcopacy into something more profound. That's my theory, though, but there's nothing in the documents that explain his going native. And like I said, even those who lived during this time were kind of mystified by it. Sorry, Ryan, I can't hear you.
Oops, left my mute on. So now he becomes the primate of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and then he comes into conflict with the king. So we talked a little bit before. Henry's trying to reform the laws. He's trying to make the church more subservient to the way he thinks it always has been, or at least should be. And he wants to kind of unify the system of law. What are some of the things that Henry does, and how do those cause conflict with Thomas?
Yeah, well, I think this is a complicated issue, and I think the best way to break it down is we can talk about what Henry was trying to do, what Thomas responded, and then maybe what the truth of the matter was, or some other observations from history. We mentioned that Henry was trying to reconstitute a sort of royal dominance over the church that he associated with the reign of his Norman ancestors. But in reality, he's actually trying to go further than anything they ever had. So part of Henry's program is to get this royal dominance, right, over the church. And in 1163, this is, I think, the year after Becket becomes primate, he summons all the bishops to a synod at Winchester, and he asked them to approve, to sanction some articles that he didn't tell them what they were yet. He says, I'm going to be coming out with some stuff. He's like, I'm going to drop some sick new articles next year, and I need your support. And he just referred to them as the avite consuetudines, which is the what is that, like the customs of my customs of the grandfathers? Yeah, the customs of my grandfather. And he says, I want the church's support, but I'm not going to tell you what they are yet. I'm still working on them. So most of the bishops are inclined to go along with it. Becket is a little bit, he sees some red flags. I want you to sign something without knowing what it is. He says, fine, I trust you
to see what's in it.
Yeah. Yes, you have to pass it to see what's in it. Thank God we're so better off under democracy than we were in these medieval kingdoms.
No kidding. We know what they used to say too is that, if you have a king, what happens when you get some senile old man running your kingdom? Yeah, that's right.
Oh gosh, that's good. That's rich. So Becket, though, he gets some red flags because he knows the king is cunning, and he says, Becket says, okay, we will provisionally agree to these avite consuetudines, but we're going to add the clause insofar as they preserve our order. That is, insofar as they preserve the rights of the episcopacy. And this really annoys Henry. By the way, in the intro you wrote for the book that I just did, you made some parallels between Thomas More and Thomas Becket that are very insightful. And we, of course, when Becket wants to insert the clause insofar as they preserve our order, any scholar of the Reformation period of England should be thinking insofar as the law of God allows, right? Same sort of clause, right? So this really annoys Henry, and he institutes a series of petty harassment against Becket, like auditing his finances and all these kind of using the law to annoy Becket to kind of show his displeasure. But the following year, the Avite Consuetudines are brought into the public, and this is the so-called Constitutions of Clarendon, which are 16 articles asserting the royal supremacy. Now, we're not going to go through all the articles. I could mention the one that caused the most concern at the time was the one about Premeditation clerks, which we'll talk about. But also there was a stipulation that the bishops could not travel out of the country without the king's permission. They could not go to appeal to the Pope without the king's permission. That no person who was a vassal of the king could be excommunicated without the king's permission. So this all amounted to royal control over the church. But the most controversial issue in the Constitution of Clarendon was the statute requiring the clergy accused of crimes to be tried by secular courts. Now, this was the issue of criminous clerks. Now, why did Henry want this? What was his argument? At the time, clergy, of course, were tried by ecclesiastical courts and laity by civil courts. Now, because the clergy included all minor orders as well, there was a considerable amount of the population. Sometimes they say, oh, one-fourth, one-third of the population was clergy. I don't know if that's accurate or not. It sounds inflated to me, but there was a lot of people that were clergy. Now, Henry asserted that this was necessary to maintain order. He claimed that in 10 years of his reign, there'd been 100 clerical murders, that priests and clerics had murdered 100 people. I'm sure there was probably some clerical crimes or maybe even murders because this is the Middle Ages. But I don't know. That sounds exaggerated to me. Henry also asserted that the burden of innocence in a clerical court was too light because you could get off by compurgation, which is where you just get 12 witnesses to come forward and swear to your innocence, right? So you just need to get 12 of your friends. And of course, if you're a bishop, you've got lots of people that could come swear to your innocence. He also said the punishments were not severe enough. Basically, all they could do was degradation from the clerical state, what we call defrocking. And I think they also allowed flogging on some circumstances. But in the secular court, you could confiscate land, mutilation, death, all the good stuff, So the king argued that this was essential to maintain order in the kingdom, that he couldn't have, 25% of his subjects that were not subject to secular law. So that was his argument. Now, Becket had uncompromising resistance to this provision. And even the English bishops were urging Becket to yield, but Becket would not. He even threatened them for going along with Henry. And this was the issue that sent Becket into exile. Henry was pushing the levers of the state to try to harass Becket, pressure him. And when Becket got word that the king was about to condemn him, he fled to Louis VII of France and stayed in exile there for 6 years. So now Becket's objection to this was actually an ethical one. He said that it was unjust punishment, that it constituted double punishment. Because let's say you have a cleric who commits a crime, right? For that cleric to be punished with death or any other civil penalty, he first had to be degraded from the priesthood, and then he had to be handed over to the secular arm. But if he was degraded, if he was defrocked, then that was already his punishment. And then if you hand him over to the secular court, he's being punished a second time. So I think this is a real interesting argument, because for Becket's thinking, the locus of the punishment is on the condemned person. Like that's where the locus of the punishment is, on the condemned person, who can only be punished for a crime one time. Now you contrast this with modern thinking, where the locus of punishment is like it resides with the punishers, right? Who all get to line up to take their pound of flesh. So you can have a single crime. You know, you can go in and rob a store, and somehow you're getting charged 10 times with 10 different charges, right? And then you can have consecutive sentences pile up. And then even if you're found innocent in a civil criminal court, you can be charged in a civil court. So a person today can be punished 20 times for a single crime. So like today, the locus of punishment is on the punishers to all take their piece out of the person. Whereas for Becket, he's looking at it like the accused can only be punished once. Either they're degraded or they're punished in the civil court. But once we degrade them, that's their punishment, you know, so you can't degrade them and then hand them over. So he made a strong ethical argument against this. And this was his major objection to it. Obviously, you know, the church's prerogatives were at stake too. But just for Becket, this struck him as profoundly unjust. So that was the king's rationale and Becket's rationale. And if I can, I want to speak to the history of it, to the king's actual, like if the king, he calls this the customs of his grandfather. Was this the customs of his grandfather is what I want to address. Now, what's interesting is that if you go back to the Anglo-Saxon era, it is true that clerics came before secular courts, but, and this is a huge but, this is such a big but, I cannot lie. Sorry.
Oh boy. Well played.
So in the Anglo-Saxon, so Henry's looking back and saying in the Anglo-Saxon era and before, like you had courts where clerics were coming before secular courts. Yes, but that's only because there was one court. There was something called the Shire Court, or sometimes called the Hundreds Court. And if you went to the Hundred Court, if you were going to the Hundred Court, you would see the bishop and the alderman sitting side by side, right? The clerical power and the secular power, both sitting at the court. And then you would get all the cases were tried there, but you would get a different judge depending on your state. So if you come into the Hundreds Court and you're like, I'm a cleric, then the bishop judges it, right? Under ecclesiastical law. If you're a layman, then the alderman or the sheriff judges it. So even though clergy were coming to a court that was secular, insofar as the king's representative was there, they were not being tried by laymen. Clerics were still being tried by bishops, right? Now, after the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror is the one that splits this up. William says, henceforth, no lord is to meddle in any case where clerical privilege is concerned. And William the Conqueror splits them up and says, we want separate clerical courts, separate, lay courts. Now, Henry I was Henry II's grandfather. And in the laws of Henry I, we can find a law that says specifically, and this is in his collection of laws, the Leges Henrici, it says no accusation, be it for a grave crime, be it for a light offense, is to be brought against any ordained clerk except before his bishop. And then a few years later in the Decretals of Gratian, only 5 years after the death of Henry I, it says, it's understood that a clergyman is not to be brought before the public courts, either in a civil or criminal case, unless the bishop refuses to pass judgment. So Henry II was trying to frame the constitutions of Clarendon as a restoration, right, of the powers that were executed under his grandfather. But the English kings before Henry II had never exercised the right to try clerics in lay courts. This was an innovation that Henry was pushing under a guise of return to ancient practice, I think in the hopes that the anarchy of the previous 30 years had kind of erased people's memory about what it was like under the earlier kings. So there never was a custom, as far as anyone can tell, of lay courts trying clerics. It was something that Henry was pushing, a novelty.
Indeed. So let's talk about Becket's exile from France, or to France.
Yeah.
And he flees Henry, And at this time, he's even seeking to be released from the bishopric of Canterbury. So, what kind of things does he busy himself with in France? I understand he meets Pope Alexander III at some point here.
Yeah, he does meet Alexander III, and Alexander III supports Becket against the constitutions of Clarendon because the Pope can see that that papal, papal prerogative is on the line here as well. The constitutions say that a bishop can't travel to Rome to consult the Pope without the king's permission, and it also has this vague line that that the bishop can't do anything contrary to the interests of the kingdom. That can be interpreted very, very broadly, right? But Alexander III was a little bit more diplomatic. He was hoping there was a more diplomatic solution. Becket proposed excommunicating Henry and all his supporters, but Alexander ordered Becket to do nothing. He said, "I just want to work, the diplomatic back channels." He tells Becket, "Stop provoking the king. Just let this simmer, and I will try to use my influence to settle this." But so Becket waits a few months, and then something sets him off. I'm not sure what, but he delays, and then he excommunicates some of Henry's advisors for infringing on the church's rights. And at this point, Alexander intervenes and he scrambles to try to put out the fire, because Becket, from Alexander's point of view, Becket is like throwing wood on the fire, making it worse. So Alexander writes letters to both sides saying, like, calm down, calm down. And he sends papal legates to England to try to hammer out this matter. So the Pope is anxiously trying to fix this. And what Alexander III is doing is he's trying to avoid the kind of blowout that you had with Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory the Great. He does not want that. He wants like a diplomatic solution. So Becket is passing his time, writing letters, working on this case, fraternizing with the clergy of France. Now, remember, this wasn't a foreign land to Becket. I mean, Becket was a French Norman, but he was staying in French lands outside of the Norman Reach because those lands belonged to Henry. So he's kind of biding his time, staying in the monastery. And I think this is a time in his life when he's really deepening his spiritual life. There's not much written about how he passed his day-to-day life there, but we can only imagine that, freed from the burdens of all the political stuff, that he probably was getting enmeshed in the monastic life, and deepening his spirituality, I would assume. But what's interesting about and this is a real interesting what if, around this time while he's in exile, this Bishop of Oxford, Bishop of Norwich, who is confusingly named John of Oxford, Bishop of Norwich, he went to consult with the Pope, and he came back to England and he started spreading the rumor that Alexander III was about to depose Becket. And this is interesting. We have a lot of news right now in the church about, can the Pope just depose a bishop, right? Unilaterally. So he starts spreading this rumor that the Pope is going to depose Becket. And Alexander III is forced to fire up all these letters throughout Europe denying, I shouldn't say denying, I should say telling John of Oxford to shut up. He says, you're making things worse. You are damaging the reputation of the impartiality of the papacy. But he doesn't outright deny that he wants to depose Becket, which I think is interesting. So what we get behind the scenes is the sense that Alexander supports Becket on principle, but is profoundly annoyed with Becket's behavior, profoundly annoyed with how Becket is handling the situation. Alexander was already dealing with a huge crisis with Frederick Barbarossa. He had an anti-pope that he was dealing with. And I think he was just profoundly irritated at the way that Becket seemed to be, from his point of view, making the situation worse. So he was in no mood. The Pope was in no mood to pick a fight with King Henry, the second most powerful European monarch at the time. So I think Alexander was principled, but he was not foolish. He's already fighting with Barbarossa. He doesn't want to fight with King Henry. So at this point, Becket escalates things by again excommunicating 7 more royal officials with no prior warning, and against the Pope's advice. The Pope had advised him not to excommunicate any more individuals, and he excommunicated 7 more. Now, at this point, Alexander felt like he was close to reaching a settlement, and then Becket kind of threw a wrench in everything by excommunicating these people. You get the impression, too, that Becket and Alexander aren't communicating well about what the other is up to, right? So Alexander has to kind of take the wind out of Becket's sails by allowing the excommunicated to be absolved by the Archbishop of Rouen. You know, if someone's solemn excommunication is supposed to be reserved to the Pope to absolve, that's the way Becket intended these excommunications. So the Pope has to negate Becket and say, no, you can go to the Archbishop of Rouen and he will absolve you instead of coming to Rome, which Becket disliked. But what are you going to do? It was the Pope, you know. So this is how things are going. Just a lot of wrangling while he's in France.
Right. Do you get the sense here too that Becket is just going too far? He's just pushing too hard at this stage.
I think so. I mean, I understand his objections, but you know, when you really dig into the history and get past like the hagiography of it, it's difficult to find reasons to justify why Becket did some of these things, like excommunicating 7 officials with no prior warning, no admonition, anything like that. You know, excommunication is supposed to be the last, resort. And it seems like Becket is just getting a little loose with it. These aren't even the last excommunications he'll do. He's got some more up his sleeve still. So yeah, I mean, I think he was a little overzealous, and I can understand Alexander III's frustration. I mean, Alexander III was one of the greatest canonist pope of the middle, maybe other than Innocent III, Right. But he was, I mean, Alexander III knew diplomacy, he knew law, he was brilliant. And, I think Alexander was right that a more nuanced diplomatic approach was needed here. But, I think there was just a lot of bad blood between Becket and these people, and it was, making things hotter. So, but yeah, I would agree with that assessment.
So now Henry II comes to France, and there is an attempt at reconciliation, and the chroniclers tell the story that Becket, made up with Henry, but he knew he was going back to England to die. Let's talk a little bit about that. How does this reconciliation come about? And was it kind of, as the chroniclers of the time say, that he saw his end coming, or was this kind of something more accidental?
Well, yeah. So okay. So what brings about the reconciliation is the issue of the crowning of Henry's heir. Of course, Becket is away in France, so Henry has his heir crowned by the Archbishop of York. Becket considers this an infringement on the rights of Canterbury that had traditional prerogatives to crown the king's successors, right? So Becket lays an interdict on England, on all of England. He's like, interdict for this. Now, Henry wanted to avoid this, and so he goes to see Becket, and they negotiate a return. And here's what Henry proposes. He says, I will see to it that I will make amends for the infringement on Canterbury's rights. And as for the constitutions of Clarendon, he just doesn't bring them up. He's like, we don't need to talk about that. I'm just not going to push it right now. My personal theory, at the time, Becket was already in his mid-50s. Henry was still in his 30s, in his like 37. I think Henry's plan was to simply wait for Becket to die at this point and push the constitutions of Clarendon once Becket died. That's my theory. But so Becket said, okay, I'll return to England on those terms. And he comes back. Now, remember, the king had said, I will amend you the infringement of Canterbury's rights regarding this thing with York. Becket agrees to that. And he comes back to England. And then immediately when he returns to England, he excommunicates the Bishop of York and those who had crowned the prince. This is the event that throws Henry into the paroxysm of rage that leads him to utter his famous words, which we need to talk about. But when Becket went back, I think, I don't know, the chroniclers all say that he knew that he was in trouble when he went back. But what I didn't know until I really started digging into the chronicles is that there was like campaigns of harassment and terrorism against Becket as soon as he got back to England by the king's supporters. When Becket got back to his estate, one of the king's supporters came into his stables and chopped the tails off his horses and mules, which was the medieval equivalent of like breaking the windows out of your car. You know, they went into his cellar and they beat up his cellarer and stole his wine. You know, so there was like these coordinated, like maybe terrorism is too strong a word, but vandalism, you know, against Becket's person and his property. You know, rumors going through the street, like people telling him like you're a dead man, you know, this sort of stuff. And it really worked on Becket's consciousness. He condemned, like when he gave his homily at Christmas that year, he brought up in his homily, he's like, some people came and chopped the tail off my mule, and this is going on, this is unjust. And then he excommunicated he excommunicated he knew who was doing these things. He excommunicated them at his homily on Christmas Eve. Imagine you go to Christmas homily and you hear an excommunication.
Like
so I think
exclude him from our Holy Mother Church and all her sacraments in heaven or on earth.
Yes. Now, let's talk about how we get to the actual killing. So Henry is in France, or in Normandy at his castle. And when he hears about these excommunications, he takes counsel with his bishops. And everybody knows that Henry blurted out something to the effect of, "Won't anyone rid me of this troublesome priest?" We all know that Henry said something to that effect. But what most people don't know is that it was a bishop that provoked him to say that. He was in the company of the excommunicated bishops, the Bishop of York, London, and Salisbury. And as they were talking, one of the bishops, and the chroniclers don't say who, I think to protect his identity, one of the bishops says to the king, "Ask counsel from your barons and knights. It's not for us to say what must be done, but know this, as long as Thomas lives, you will have neither good days, nor a peaceful kingdom, nor a quiet life." Henry's comment was made in response to that comment. Once a bishop said that, then Henry said, he was thrown to a rage and uttered his famous words, "Won't anyone rid me of this meddlesome priest?" So it was a bishop who put the idea into Henry's head by saying, as long as Thomas lives, you're not going to have peace. It's not for me to say what you should do about that. Talk to your knights. So, you know, so that's how that went down.
Right. Not. Yeah, that's it. Actually, I didn't know that it was a bishop that actually provoked the statement. Do you think that Henry actually meant to have Thomas killed?
No, I do not. And there's 4 reasons for this. First, there was 4 knights, Fitzhurst, Tracy, Lebret, and Morville. When they left the castle to go to England, they all took separate routes to cover their tracks. If they were on a mission from the king, why would they be trying to cover their tracks from the king's castle to the English Channel? They clearly didn't want to be followed. But if the king ordered them, why would the king follow them, right? The second reason is that when Henry discovered they were gone, he sent 3 courtiers to overtake them and stop them from crossing the channel. But they'd already crossed the channel by the time the 3 couriers reached it. Number 3, when the knights first entered the cathedral, they left all their weapons outside. Their intention seemed to have been to talk to Thomas and get him to come to a conference with the king. And this is borne out by the first-hand witnesses who said when the knights first came in, they didn't attack Thomas. They tried to say, "Come with us. You're coming to a council with the king." Number 4, even after the scene turned hostile, even after the knights went and got their weapons, they did not attack Thomas. They tried to kidnap him first. They tried to heave him up on Tracy's back and carry him fireman style outside of the cathedral to take him away. And only when a scuffle broke out, when Becket resisted and started fighting back, did they attack him physically. So I think just looking at the actual facts of how it went down, it's hard to justify those facts with that this was a premeditated murder. But, you know, I don't know. Especially the fact that the king sent couriers to stop the knights, you know, when they went to the channel. But that's my opinion.
Right. Here's another more humorous take on the whole thing.
I can't understand it. Edmund doesn't even like religion.
That's impossible.
is the Archbishop of Canterbury.
Yes, and the Archbishop of Canterbury is also a naughty little boy, whose bottom I had to smack for relieving himself in default.
Oh, that was a long time ago.
It was last Thursday.
Well, the boys turned out well. A long and healthy life to him. I thank God that in my lifetime, never again shall I have to say, who will rid me of this turbulent priest?
And what is that?
It's something that my ancestor, Henry II, once said when he was having trouble with Thomas a Becket. He was sitting at a table like this with two drunken knights, and he yelled out, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?"
What?
Oh, God save us. I said, who will rid me of this turbulent priest?
Meaning who?
The Archbishop of Canterbury, of course!
That's from Blackadder.
Oh gosh. Nobody opens his mouth as wide as Brian Blessed does.
No.
That's great.
No,
I think the reality of the situation was somewhere between premeditated murder and that.
Right. Although it seems that, you know, Henry had a good bet that Thomas a Becket is going to die at some point.
Yeah, I think he had a good bet about that, but you know, in terms of that week, probably not. I can't imagine the king wanted to, you know, he'd worked so hard to smooth things over with the church, with the Pope and everything, and then he's going to intentionally murder the Archbishop of Canterbury right in the octave of Christmas in his cathedral. I have a hard time believing that the king intended that in a literal sense. It seems to be that the knights were going to kidnap Becket and force him to come to the king's to call on the king, and then force some kind of settlement on Becket while he was in duress.
Right now, there a lot of people, because there's some artwork that seems to give this notion. They think that he was killed during Mass, but what was he actually doing when the knights showed up?
He was eating dinner. Well, when the night, so this took a while. It didn't happen in a minute. You know, he was eating dinner when the knights showed up, and they came into the dining room, and they got into an argument. The king's men were hostile in Becket's presence, and this was actually right before Vespers. Okay, he was eating dinner before Vespers in the dining hall, and Becket accused them of betraying fealty to him because Becket had been was Chancellor, and he said, "You all swore oaths to me as Chancellor, and now you're betraying your fealty." And they denied that they owed him anything, and they made fun of him. They said he threatened to excommunicate them. One of the knights said, "Who haven't you excommunicated?" Which I think is funny. So then I think they plan to kidnap him, and Fitzer says, "Whoever is the king's man, get out of the way. Like if you're on our side, stand aside, because we're going to seize this fella." They all go out to get their arms. They left him outside. So they get their arms, and then they lock all the entryways to the cathedral so the people of the town can't come in. And this was what's embarrassing, is that they had aid from members of the cathedral chapter themselves. Members of the cathedral chapter were helping these knights to get Becket to kidnap him or do whatever they're going to do. Becket was still reclining on the couch in his dining room, and his supporters saying, "You need to get out of here." And he's like, Becket says, "I'm prepared to die here." And the Chronicles report that one of his monks said, "Well, you're prepared to die, but we're all sinners. We're not ready to die." So we're not prepared. No one here wants to die except for you. So the monks come in. They tell Becket the knights are coming back with their weapons, and they want to lock him. They want to lock him out. You know, they want to lock the knights out. So they're trying to lock the doors. And Becket is yelling at. He's kind of like challenging them, like, "I'm not afraid." You know, like. and he utters his famous line, the church should not be turned into a castle, So the real scene is Becket's in his dining hall, and he's kind of like yelling, like, bring it on, basically. I'm paraphrasing. And the monks are like restraining him, and the monks are locking the doors. The knights end up breaking down the doors with these workmen's axes. And so the monks basically lift Becket forcibly and drag him out of the dining hall. They drag him up the stairs, and Becket is yelling, let them come, I will go out to them. And away, cowards, he's yelling, away, cowards, to the monks who are trying to prevent him from engaging with the knights. I forbid you to shut the door. The church must not be turned into a castle. Then Becket himself broke away and flung the doors open. And at this point, most of his followers fled. They're like, all right, this guy, Becket, whatever, we tried. And most of them flee, except for just a couple of his most loyal followers. So they drag him up into the transept, where the monks are chanting Vespers, and it's all dark, right? This is evening. It's Christmas, so it's very dark, candlelit, easy to hide in there. And they convince him to mount the stairs and go up to the choir. While he's on the stairs, the knights break in, and they yell, stay, where is the traitor Becket? Becket identifies himself and comes down from the steps, and he stands in front of a large column at the bottom of the steps. This is where the murder will happen, at the column. So they trade insults, and then they tell Becket he has to come with them. Becket says, I'm not going anywhere. And they try to forcibly lift him up and put him on the back of William de Tracy. Becket is like fighting back, like pounding with his fists, and he grabs Tracy's chainmail and throws him to the ground. And then the whole group of them kind of fall down in a pile on the floor. And then one of the knights gets angry, and he takes his sword and he whacks Becket upside the head with the broadside of the sword, not to kill him, just to injure him, right? But Tracy, who is the one that was knocked down, he gets up and he's furious, and he loses temper, and he raises his sword and he swings it at Becket. And Becket's monk tries to protect him, Edward Grimm, the Saxon monk. The blow is deflected off of Grimm's arm and slices Becket through the shoulder. And then Becket starts saying, like, I'm resolved to die for the faith of the church, and etc. Into your hands I commend my spirit. All the words that the chroniclers say that he said while he was dying. And then they hit him a few more times, but then another knight comes up and delivers him just a crushing blow. He hits him in the head with his sword so hard that the top of Becket's skull comes off, and the sword shatters on the pavement, breaks into pieces, and his head is just open. And at that point, he's dead. Once your head comes open. But the worst part of this is a subdeacon, a ordained person, comes up, who was a supporter of the knights. A subdeacon comes up and he takes a sword and he shoves it in the wound, and then he scatters Becket's brains all over the floor. And then he says, now the traitor is dead, let's go. And then they leave. And so Becket was killed at the pillar, not in a posture of prayer, but in a scuffle, kind of in a scuffle.
So somewhere more like this.
What?
Are you able to see the screen I've got shared here?
No, I don't see anything.
Okay. That's all right. Looks like it went in over here. So anyway, I had a picture of the shrine up.
Okay, well, you'll see in pictures, it'll often show Becket like praying at the altar, being murdered from behind. Now, the reason that this is believed is because after Becket was killed, of course, the church put an altar at the pillar, right, at the spot where he was murdered. They constructed an altar, and then there was like a little stone marking the spot where Becket fell. So future generations of pilgrims naturally assumed that Becket died at the altar because the stone where he was killed was in front of the altar. And that led to this idea that he was killed at the altar, which led to the idea that he was killed during Mass. He was killed during Vespers, but he wasn't saying Vespers. He was, like I said, he was standing at the pillar arguing with the knights. So that's how it went down, and that's how I think we get the hagiography of him kneeling at the pillar. Now, even though he wasn't killed during Mass kneeling, the fact that he was killed how he was, I don't think that detracts from the fact that ultimately this whole thing was about the rights of the church. You know, the immediate. Oh gosh, yeah. What is that sculpture above it? Is that looks modern?
It's definitely modern.
Yeah,
So,
it's
but
like
this is the shrine they have set up at Canterbury currently.
yeah, it's like Game of Thrones architecture.
Right.
Yeah. So the immediate cause of Becket's death was this debate over York versus Canterbury, right? And the coronation of the king's heir. But this took place in a larger context of church-state struggle that was going on throughout this whole century. So I don't think it makes Becket any less a martyr, you know, of the church than that he didn't die praying at mass. You know, the church declared him a martyr right away. It was evident that he died, for the honor of the church and for the prerogatives of his see, you know, against royal incursion. So, but that's where we get that idea of him being killed at mass.
Right. Makes sense. So then the aftermath of his death, the hair shirt is discovered on Becket. And so immediately it's declared he's a saint, and he's held as a martyr all around. How does Henry respond to this once he finds out about what took place?
Yeah, well, what's interesting is when Becket first died, the monks are going around his body, and at first the reaction of the chapter is like, "Oh, what a shame! Blood has been shed in the cathedral." But still, that's what happens when you resist the will of the king, you know. But then they discover the hair shirt, and they discover that Becket was practicing asceticism, and they start saying, "Oh, we had a saint in our midst, and we didn't know it." You know, when Henry hears about it, he is, well, I don't know. The chroniclers kind of point him as not necessarily horrified, but repentant. You know, kind of like, "Oh no, I didn't intend this to happen." I think his response is one of like, "Oh great, my situation just got way more complicated now." You know, like, oh gosh, like now what's going to happen? You know, shortly after, he's forced to swear oaths that he had nothing to do with it. You know, not by way of intending it or facilitating it. This was before he could do penance. It was declared that he should do penance for the death, because even if Henry didn't deliberately will for Becket to be murdered, it definitely, his words are the immediate cause of the murder, right? That's what sent the knights off. So the king had some blame, you know, so he was willing to make amends. I mean, the idea of Henry II doing this, you know, kneeling before Becket's tomb, taking blows from every member of the chapter. I think each monk gave him 2 blows or something, which is funny because in the movie it shows, I think there's just 2 monks whipping him, you know. But the way it really went down was every member of the chapter got a certain amount of blows, and they processed by in a line, and everyone gave him a blow. Now, what I'd love to know is if they were real blows or not, or if someone told them like, "Hey, look, this is the king, like, hit him with kid gloves," you know, like, or if they were really like whack,
Right.
you know.
Look, every day you get to hit a king.
Yeah. So, but if Henry wasn't truly, if Henry didn't truly think this was a disaster, if he didn't truly think that this was something that needed to be made up for, that peace needed to be attained, I can't imagine a man of the will and determined. I mean, can you imagine Henry VIII doing this? You know,
No.
or I mean,
Never.
and Henry II was just as determined as Henry VIII. He had an iron will. But unlike Henry VIII, Henry II actually wanted to be in communion with the church. So I can't imagine he wouldn't have done that if he wasn't truly wanting to make amends in some sense. Mute. Take your mute off.
Did it again. What's the effect on church and state relations following this particular event? Did Becket's stand ultimately help the church, or was it all in vain?
Well, it helped. It helped. I mean, the constitutions of Clarendon. Now, later, the provisions of Clarendon are going to creep back in through various kings over various times. I think in the 1300s, you get some provisions of it that creep back in. Henry VIII certainly will bring back the substance of them, but in the short term, I think it helped the church. You'll see King John and King Richard trying to push for trying to push for similar things like the constitutions. But they don't go anywhere. Of course, John ends up getting England placed under interdict by Innocent III, who ends up being the receiving England as a papal fief, right? But in terms of the church's moral life, I mean, Becket was the first notable martyr in a long time, right? You hadn't really had any martyrs since the time of like the conversion of Germany in the Carolingian times. So it gave the church a real notable martyr, kind of like crowned the whole investiture struggle with this martyr in the cause of the church's independence. It created Canterbury as a pilgrim shrine on par with Rome or Compostela or any of these other places. Probably, I mean, in Western Europe, the most renowned pilgrim shrine for centuries, a place of piety and a pilgrimage until I think the last recorded pilgrimage there was in 1538. So, I mean, I think it was good for the church. Now, the idea of, I think we mentioned it before. We were talking about clerical sex abuse.
Right.
Yeah.
So there's a documentary actually that's out there, which I can't find it right now. A couple of years ago, it was a BBC documentary, and the way those work is you get some guy, some prof, some PhDs, whatever, and then he goes to the BBC for and says, "Hey, I've got this idea," and they look at it, and then somebody approves, and he gets funding, and then they produce it. Yeah. Which actually, I like the fact that they can produce it and narrate it and all these things. But on the other hand, this fellow's doing a history of law, and he gets to this whole question and criminus clerks and the whole business back at Clarendon, and it laments St. Thomas Becket's opposition and says, and then he adds as he concludes that section, "I lay the entire sex scandal of today at the feet of Thomas Becket." How legitimate is that in terms of church governance, church prosecution of criminals, etc.? Because some people will look at it as like, hey, well, if the medieval system was there and the church was just the one to judge these pedophile priests or whatnot, what's all their friends, and they just let them off, and so this seems to be a popular idea with people.
So the idea that if secular courts were in charge of this, that the justice would be completely pure and untainted, and that.
That's what they seem to think, albeit then you have the current nominee for the Supreme Court that lets them off light. So
the one that doesn't know what a woman is?
Right, that one.
Yeah, well, so number one, it's ridiculous to think that just because you have a secular court means that the quality of the justice is going to be better, right? I mean, it's kind of like, oh, geez, I guess secular courts never take away people's freedom or are never corrupt, right? That's kind of ridiculous.
Never happened.
Yeah. Also, the idea that a church court can't adequately deal with that isn't accurate either, because clerical sex abuse has to do with corruption of the clergy, not with the clergy. It's qua clergy, right? I mean, there's been times in church history where clerical sex abuse has been dealt with extreme harshness. I don't remember which Italian city, but during the Renaissance, there was places where if you got caught something like that, you were sentenced to row in the galleys for 10 years. Mm-hmm. So it's not as if the church was inept at dealing with this, so that putting something under the secular power automatically makes it better. I just think that's ridiculous. It's easy to imagine that other groups would have handled it better than the church did today, but it's precisely because the church isn't living up to today what it should be that we have these problems, because the church isn't exercising its full, isn't being what it should, right? So if anything, I think these problems get worse when the church is weaker, not when it's stronger, right? Not when it's flourishing. But at any rate, it doesn't really make any sense. And the idea that like, oh, if we give the state more control over things, it'll be better. That's just like, I mean, where's that? Yeah, that always works, right? And I think people need to keep this. I do think people need to keep this in mind, though, that there's a lot of groups and organizations out there today. They're like, well, we need these lay boards to judge these cases. We need lay control over these things. That is just, I understand the frustration, but that is just not the Catholic way of looking at this. It's just not the Catholic way of looking at this. And really, and you and I have talked about this for years, but modern people have a profound mistrust about the idea of two different law codes existing simultaneously in the same state, like having canon law, then, secular law. It's like they want there to just be one law code. But, in the Middle Ages, people were under different law codes depending on what group they belonged to, right? And that seemed to function okay for them. But so, I don't know. The whole thing seems just not a very Catholic approach to it.
Right. So lastly, we have your book.
Yes.
Again. So let's talk a little bit about the book. So republished from Cruachan Hill. Did I say that right?
Cruachan, but whatever.
Cruachan.
Yeah.
So the link is in the description. Do check it out. So let's talk a little bit about this book. It is drawn from Arthur Pernan Stanley's classic lectures from his Memorials of Canterbury series. So yeah, go ahead.
Well, Arthur, I discovered this book 20 years ago. I found a dilapidated copy on a giveaway shelf somewhere at Ave Maria College that had belonged to some priest's library 50 years ago. And Arthur Penrhyn Stanley was an Anglican historian during the time of the Oxford movement, and he was the Dean of Westminster. He was a Canon of Canterbury, and he was a very notable historian. He wrote a very internationally recognized work on the history of Palestine. And at his time at Canterbury, he delivered a series of lectures on the history of Canterbury, the church itself, and the city, and the pilgrimages and everything. And Stanley was a notable historian because at this time, most history was done just by reading documents, right? Just by reading the primary source, which is great. Always read the primary sources. But Stanley was one of the first historians at all to incorporate, I guess what we would call local research or archaeological research, where he didn't just write a history of Palestine from the sources. He actually went to Palestine and did investigations. Similarly with Canterbury, he didn't just read the sources. Because he was a canon of Canterbury, he went around and he did investigation into the architecture of Canterbury, figured out okay, here's where the column used to be. Here's where the original scene happened. Here's what it used to look like. So he was very notable for bringing in actual localized empirical observations and archaeology into his history. So I read this book when I was in college. I loved it. It's drawn entirely from the archaeology and the primary sources. It gives you way more information about the Church of Canterbury, the details leading up to the murder itself, the murderers, Canterbury as a shrine. Most of the book, part one, focuses on the murder itself. The book starts with Becket's return from exile. So the whole first half of the book is centered just on the murder. And then the second half of the book is about the history of Canterbury as a pilgrimage site and what it was like going to Canterbury, and then the dissolution. Stanley I mentioned he was an Anglican clergyman during the time of the Oxford movement. He never jumped ship and went to Rome, but he was a peer of Newman, and he defended the Tractarians after Newman converted to Rome. There was a movement in the Anglican Church to expel all the Tractarians from the church. Stanley used his influence at the time as Dean of Westminster to intervene with the See of Canterbury, the Anglican See of Canterbury, and said, no, these Tractarians, even if some of us disagree with them, they're providing very valuable a gift to the church by their research and by their argumentation. So I see him as kind of like the C.S. Lewis of the Tractarian movement. He went so far and then didn't jump ship. So I think this is about the best. It goes into the real nitty gritty of the murder. It's like it tells you where all the people were standing and who struck what blow. And what I really like about it too, and I've never read this in any other Becket biography, is after he details the murder, he goes on an aside and he says, now let's see what happened to the murderers for the rest of their lives. We never think about that. What happened to these 4 knights? Where did they go? And they have some really compelling stories. I'll just tell one. I know we're running up against time, but De Tracy, who was the one that struck the first blow, they all had. Oh, here's what's really interesting, and what ironic, because the constitutions of Clarendon were not passed, since killing Becket was an ecclesiastical crime, the most severe sentence any of them could get was excommunication, and that was it. If the constitutions of Clarendon had been passed, they would have been hung, drawn, and quartered or something,
Right.
So the very work of Becket preventing that from getting passed is what saved their lives, But anyhow, they were all excommunicated pending doing a pilgrimage to the Holy Land to atone for the crime, and they all made the pilgrimage, except for Tracy. He tried to make the pilgrimage many times. They were all sincerely repentant. It describes how after they left the scene of the crime and they had time to brood on it, the sheer horror of what they had done kind of crept over them. And Tracy tried to go on a pilgrimage many times. He even made it all the way down to the boot of Italy, but he could never get there because there was always adverse weather or the wind stopped him. And I think he died. There's debate about where he died. Some people say he died in Italy, waiting for the winds to change. Some people say he died in France. But it led to this saying that went into the Tracy family crest that says the wind is always against the Tracys, because he was prevented from carrying out his prevented from carrying out his penance. I pray, since he was truly repentant and he was trying to carry out the penance, that hopefully he made his way to heaven. But it's interesting, and the medieval chroniclers, they had a field day with this idea of like the death of the persecutor.
Right.
Tracy was the one to strike the first blow, so he was the one that couldn't make his pilgrimage.
Right.
But I just think it's interesting, and that there's a whole chapter in the book on the fate of the knights, which I think is great reading. So I do have a link. It's going to be I'm shipping them out in like mid-May. If you want to pre-order, there's a little discount. There should be a link somewhere to below to check it out.
We do have the link in the description. Let's see, is this showing up on the screen?
I don't know. I'm looking at StreamYard, not at the YouTube link.
Okay. It doesn't seem to be. That's weird. But anyway, so was trying to share the screen, but I don't know why that's not working. But anyway, the link is in the description. I also hear you found some imbecile to write a foreword to the book.
Yes, some joker named Ryan Grant. Yes, I loved your intro because, like I said, the book picks up a month before Becket's death, so it doesn't touch on any of his early life or the controversy. So your intro basically talks about things leading up to that and kind of completes the narrative. So I loved it. And I also want to mention the book has 2 original translations. In the appendices for the original text from the 1800s, there was an Anglo-Norman section about the translation of Becket's relics, and then there was some Latin about miracles at the Canterbury Shrine. And we have our mutual friend Jonathan Arrington did the translation of the Latin, and then my dear associate Dr. Olga Izzo, who was a Latin and French scholar. She was at the University of Calgary, Hillsdale, Ave Maria. I think she's pretty much retired now, but she did the translation from the Anglo-Norman, which was not easy. She spent a lot of time on it, but we eventually got a solid translation. And so I hope that this will make a original contribution, no matter how meager, to people's knowledge of Becket and these events.
Hopefully it will. So thank you all again for joining us. And please do go to Cruachan Hill Press and look for that book. And you can also visit Mediatrix Press as well. If you like what you saw here, subscribe, give us a thumbs up. If you didn't, then send it to someone who will. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Ryan.